Good morning, everyone. Let's get started. It's nice to see everybody. I've been looking forward to this event for some time, so it's really great that it's happening. As you can see, Jen's unable to join us in person. We were originally planning an in-person event, but some last-minute stuff. Jan is not able to be here in person, but has graciously agreed to hold the date and come and join us anyways on screen. So I'm really happy about that. Let me start the meeting by saying this. We are committed to upholding the values of equality and respect. In this meeting, we will endeavor to allow all voices to be heard without prejudice and all views to be listened to with respect. We commit ourselves to support each other in this endeavor. So we've got Jan with us today. Jan's going to speak for about 40 minutes, and then we're going to have some questions and answers, and we can talk with her for the remainder of the hour or beyond, depending on how much we want to discuss. We've got the room for 2 hours, so we've got plenty of time. Jan McArthur is professor in higher education and social justice at Lancaster University. With an interest in interrelationships between education and society and in the relationship between theory and practice, she works on education and social justice and the nature of higher education. She also works in political theory and has written about Theodore Adorno and Nancy Fraser. She's the author of the 2020 book, Locating Social Justice in Higher Education Research. And just to give you a flavor of some of the stuff that she writes about, I'll just give you a couple of titles of some of her many publications, articles, and book chapters. Titles such as Student Ownership of Assessment, Student Experience of the Value of Lectures for Their Learning, and Understanding Social Justice, Why It Matters. So I'm, again, very happy to be here. And let me just say, Tom White had to leave, but he also was very great in making this happen, just all the logistics. Ian is here helping with the tech, which has been super appreciated much. I would be really struggling without that, so that's very good. Let me just say a couple more words by way of introduction, is that we talk about EDI quite a bit these days. We also talk about assessment quite a bit, well, we have for some time. But those conversations, the link between those two things is something that I'm very interested to learn more about, and I think that's what we're going to be hearing something about. We also might have reasons to talk maybe less in a professional way, but about concepts such as joy and trust. I don't ever remember talking about those and talking about assessment at the same time. So it's going to be interesting to see how these things weave together. So Jan, I'm so excited that you're here. Just so delighted that we're going to get to learn from you here. And with that, I'll turn it over to you. Let's give her a round of applause.
Thank you very much, everyone. And let me just share my screen. And there. And I assume that's all working. And you can hear me okay? Yep. I think Pooyan will tell me if you can't. I'm trusting on. So thank you very much for the invitation to speak. And I'm very sorry I can't be there in person. Higher education is a very difficult place to work in at the moment. Of course, we have to recognise that there are many places that are far more difficult, but that really doesn't do a lot to help us, to help alleviate some of the stresses and pressures we feel. So I want to start from that sort of position. And what I want to do today is to try and make this link between EDI and assessment. And I suppose I'm going to make it in a fairly soft way, and I hope that makes sense. I want to start, when I'm going to speak somewhere, I always look at your mission statements and things like that, because I feel like I should know the institution I'm talking with. And so I saw this from your EDI strategy or scheme. And I was really struck by this bit here about we all have a role to play in ensuring everyone in our community feels welcomed and valued. And we can each influence this through our work, our behaviour, and our interactions with others. And the thing about assessment is that, as a rule, people don't feel as though they do have much of a sense of agency, a sense that they can change the culture, change the basic norms and so forth. And I understand the constraints that faces when we look to reform or change assessment, but I also hope to try and inspire you today to try and think creatively around that and be inspired to believe that there's a reason to try to come together and change assessment. And that the EDI implication is that this simply can make life better for all of us. So we have equality, diversity, and inclusion as very important concepts. And for me, I think of two things when I think of them. I think of justice and I think of well-being. And when I write about assessment, those are the two things I write about, justice and well-being. And well-being isn't just about students. This to me is, how do we feel when marking time comes? I annoy my colleagues often when I say that marking should be a joyous celebration of student achievement. But how on earth can it be when you've got a pile of scripts to get through and you're doing it at 3 a.m. and all the pressures around you? So we have destroyed the joy of marking, in my view, and we have created stress, and stress is very bad for us. And we are in a society that has a mental health crisis. So I see all of these things as connected to assessment. And I know people find it odd to talk about joy in assessment, but really, if you think of assessment as about what our students have learned, there can't be anything more joyous in our work, or there shouldn't be. That should be the potential. So when I wrote my book about assessment for social justice, it was really important for me that this was approached not as them versus us, about, oh, let's be more just for the students, so that makes more work for the academics. Justice means justice for all. So when I talk about more just, more fair, more inclusive, more diverse forms of assessment, it's really important to understand that this is for academics and support and professional services staff, as well as students and as well as those members of society we serve. But the feeling for a lot of academics is that we can be so overwhelmed that there seem to be barriers at every place that could let us out into something new. We start to think about doing assessment differently, but we're tired. We're tired, we're broken, maybe. We're fed up, we're angry, we're cross, disillusioned, and so we don't do it. And I suppose the aim of today's talk is to just try and say, can we break down some of those barriers and see the possibilities of doing assessment differently? Some of these will be large, some of these will be small. I inevitably have to say something about AI, talking about assessment at the moment. And I sort of wish I didn't, partly because I don't really understand it. I don't know. I can't get my mind around how we understand something that is constantly changing. But I do, in an assessment context, want to say one clear thing, that how we respond to generative AI and how we nurture holistic, authentic, and just assessment must rest on values and principles that we should have attended to long before generative AI. These are not new problems caused by this new technology. These are problems that have been laying there in the way we do assessment for a very long time. And if we had have attended to them, we would be in a much better position now to deal with the challenges and the opportunities of generative AI. And how we make the best of generative AI and how we protect against the dangers cannot rest on technical solutions alone. It requires human solutions, and no more so than in the field of university assessment. It's utter nonsense. Sorry, I'm probably at this point, I should say, I might start to annoy some people, say things that you feel quite strongly disagree with. And please, let's pick that up in the discussion. I'm not saying you should agree with me about this, but in my view, the attempt to, have AI detection software is just a beginning of madness. I'll leave that there. So the point I want to make, though, is to go back to that idea that there were principles and values that we should have attended to. And if we had attended to them, we'd be in a much better position now. And then the second point is that to improve assessment for us and for our students, we cannot just keep piling new things on top. So, and this is often what happens. Oh, okay, we've got generative AI, we've got this, we've got that. We now want to be authentic, blah, 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 blah. And so we bring in a new thing and we just put it on top. But that's never going to make assessment a joyous experience and less stressful and more meaningful. We have to be prepared to dismantle and remove some of what currently exists because it's simply not fit for practice. And in the words of Proust, the real voyage of discovery consists not in seeking new landscapes, but in having new eyes. And I suppose what I want to do for the rest of today's talk is ask you to look anew at the foundations of some of our assessment practices, and to do that for this reason of our joint commitment to EDI as it relates to both staff and students. So to just look anew and to just consider the possibility that things actually could be different. And please, I'm not naive. I know there's lots of reasons why things can't happen. But I think that the idea of thinking differently is powerful, and it helps us find those little fissures, those little cracks where radical transformative change can happen. So I'm going to look at 4 what I call foundational questions about assessment. They're not the only questions, but I think they're a good 4 that help us raise issues around EDI. Firstly, what is academic work? Because unless we're clear on that, how can we be clear about how we should assess it? But how often do we ask this question? What counts as achievement when we assess? How perfect can the assessment process be? And how important is it that we treat all students the same? So the first one, what is academic work? Well, I just want you to look at these images for a moment and to have a think about where my mind might be going. Different representations of academic work. So in my view, academic work is engaging with the minds of others. That is the core of what it is. It's never just being isolated, here's what I think about stuff. We always refer to other people. We base our ideas on the ideas that have come before, either our critical acceptance of them or our critical, rejection of them. But somehow we engage and we learn. And that's what academic work is. At its core, academic work is engaging with the minds of others. Now, this has a profound impact on how we assess, because at the heart of most university assessment practices now is the idea of an originality score. And I know in the room there'll be people saying, oh, you can Turnitin, you can use it constructively, you use it in a positive way. I've used it in a positive way, and I'm not discounting that. But on a basic level of our understanding of the nature of the academic task, the idea that we are enculturating students to think that rare danger happens when you have more engagement with the minds of others. Because this has nothing to do with plagiarism. This is all about whether things are, how many references you've used. There's nothing here about plagiarism. There's nothing here about intention to deceive. So we have got generation after generation of students. I'm old enough to remember when we used to be able to run academic work without Turnitin. And I know a lot has changed in the nature of our students, but I do not think the idea of undermining the fundamental principle that academic work is engaging with the minds of others, and students shouldn't be afraid of it. They shouldn't be taking a brilliant reference out so that they can please turn it in and get their originality score under that, which would otherwise trigger an institutional referral for academic misconduct. And for me, I think we have to see the opportunities, the alternatives we have here. As I said, believe in things like Turnitin or not, but they are not inevitable. Life did exist before them. We always have to remember this. We are making students fearful of engaging with the minds of others. And we are making a lot more work for ourselves. I see academics acting like the child catcher in Chitty Chitty Bang Bang. Anyone remember that movie? child catcher, an Australian actor actually, desperately seeking children to lock up. And there's a culture of desperately seeking plagiarism and to lock up our students' minds. And we know we're doing it for the right reasons. We think we're being professional, but we're making a lot of work for ourselves. And I think we're undermining the joyous task of engaging with the minds of others in a courteous and ethical way. And the conflation of poor referencing skills with plagiarism being the deliberate intention to deceive, has, in my view, been disastrous for academic integrity, academic writing, authentic assessment, and really, equally important, academic workloads. And I think back to when I was a student, and it's a long time ago. And, if you think about what we're trying to, get a first year student to understand about academic work, we want them to understand, how to engage with the literature, to have critical analysis, to have clear writing and presentation, to have good referencing skills, to clear building of an original argument. But why, in the last 20 years, have we criminalized one of these? We haven't for the others. We haven't said, don't have freshers talks that says, you better have critical analysis or you'll be reported. It'll be on your academic record. We don't do that because we know that we're teaching these things. And we just need to be teaching good referencing skills as something completely separate to being a child catcher. So for me, we have academic writing driven by fear and the need to please turned in, or academic writing driven by the joy of ethical and courteous engagement with the minds of others. And this is one of the foundations of assessment, is absolutely critical. So I'm making a very stark alternative, but this is one of the first things I want to put out there for us to be able to think about. My second foundational question is, what counts as achievement when we assess? So learning outcomes, it's easy to be cynical about learning outcomes and why do we predetermine the learning and all of that. And I agree with all of that. At the same time, on a practical level, when we have a curriculum and when we have, professional requirements to meet, and I don't just mean professional bodies, but I just mean our professional requirements, I think learning outcomes actually can be used in a positive way. And many of you have probably done postgraduate certificate in academic practice or the equivalent, and we've all been told which words from Kolb to use when we write our learning outcomes. And here's some examples of typical ones, to critically analyse research methods, to explain the difference, successfully undertake, demonstrate critical understanding, construct a working design prototype for a robot. These are how we've all been taught to write our learning outcomes as one of the foundations of good assessment. There is no how much. What counts as achievement in our learning outcomes is, have they met the learning outcome or not? We've added this how muchness. Now, why have we done that? Is it necessary? And is it useful, or is it actually harmful? So if we take these two, a robot or a success, the invasive biopsy procedure, let's assume that's, say, fifth year medical students, because otherwise it'd be a bit weird. But what does 67% look like? Is the invasive biopsy procedure 67% successful if they get an infection and die within 5 days? Or is it better? Is it 69 if they die within 10 days? But actually, that's 5 more days of suffering. So, what criteria do we don't, it doesn't make any sense. It doesn't make any sense. And it's not in the wording of the learning outcomes to add the how muchness. But how much of your time is spent on how muchness? And, we have the marking criteria there on the screen, that's a very North American, very, very, very precise. Look at it, it's getting down to between 73.5 and 76.9. And why do we do this? And it really is based in history and tradition, and it's based on myths that this is an incentive or that this gives feedback. It gives no feedback unless you have a common understanding of what these grades mean. Now, I haven't met John, but now I've heard him. I think John might have North American roots. I have North American colleagues who cannot feel so uncomfortable giving a grade of, say, 65, which is a perfectly respectable grade in a UK or Australian context. Now, the fact of that just shows that the number has no meaning. The number just doesn't mean anything. It's the values that we attribute to it. And unless they're shared, then this isn't really telling us anything, and it's not a sign of any achievement. And the reason we do it is to enable easy and efficient differentiation of graduates. But we're not meant to be marking in a norm-referenced way. That's unethical. We're meant to be marking against criteria. And against the criteria, anyone should be able to get any sort of mark, potentially. But we still have people, and if you're in the room and you do this, blush, because you should blush. We still have people who take normal distributions into exam boards and say, look, I've done my marking well. No, you haven't, because we're not meant to be doing that. So this how muchness is a distortion, a distraction, and it's time consuming. And it has real EDI implications. Why have I got a picture of a dishwasher there? Well, I'll give you a personal example. My husband and I pack the dishwasher very differently. My husband and I put the milk in a different place in the fridge. Now, for marital bliss, we just each do it our own way, and each puts up with the other doing it their way, because neither is better, neither is right. He doesn't stack the dishwasher 65% well, and well, probably, yeah, I'm probably doing it 90%. It's meaningless, isn't it? We each do it. We each get clean dishes. That's it. So, the problem is that when we add this how muchness, we start to be making qualitative claims that about the different quality of the work that are simply reflections of difference. And that is incredibly harmful and destructive and uncreative. We're mistaking quality with standardization. And the amount of academic labour that goes into this, when all the research on assessment says that you cannot mark to a high level of specificity. There's no research to prove it. Many, 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 many things that disprove it. And whenever I talk about this, I always get this question from the audience. So please don't ask me it. And they say, but Jan, when you're on an operating table and you look up at your surgeon, don't you want him, and it's always a him, to be the best in his class? And I just think, what a horrific idea. What a total misunderstanding of academic achievement. My surgeon's the best in his class. This is the class. I don't want the best in the class if it's a class of idiots. I want someone who's met the criteria of being able to perform that. And while socially, I'm a big believer in competition if it's sport, I'm Australian. But this translates in the assessment field to a norm-based hegemony, this belief in there being a best and that being important. When if we mark according to marking criteria that reflect our learning outcomes, these differentiations can be harmful and actually irrelevant, misleading, and time-consuming. So education isn't a race, and we shouldn't be producing a generation of students who see assessment as a race, because if they do, then they have a very strong incentive for academic misconduct. And we are more and more not able to detect academic misconduct. And we haven't been for a long time. We've had contract cheating going on for ages. We have loads of cheating in exams. The only solution is to have students who do not have an incentive to do that. And one of the ways is taking away this false idea that education, that assessment is a race. And again, if I want to go back to the idea of the surgeon, I want a nurse, surgeon, anaesthetist who have met the criteria and demonstrated they can perform the task, and who have an ongoing professional commitment to ensuring that remains the same. So it's far more important what sort of lifelong professional learner our assessment practices have nourished than the mark they got in an exam 20 years ago. When you look up at that surgeon, you know you want to be looking at a caring person who's kept up to date, who has an internal sense of responsibility that doesn't come from some bit of software or an invigilator sitting in the corner while you're being operated on. So foundation question number 3 is, how perfect can assessment process be? This links very much with the previous point. It's a development of it. There are some parts of higher education where we look at building blocks of knowledge. So in chemistry, you know, there is a level at which certain molecular things are facts, are right or wrong. Health and safety, you know, if you're teaching that in an engineering program, the same thing. There are building blocks of important knowledge, but eventually in higher education, for it to be higher education, we are working with complex forms of knowledge. We might be working on the basis of these building blocks, but we are working on with complex knowledge. And the idea of simple right, wrong, or perfect answers becomes somewhat problematic. And I want to bring in here my old friend, which I call the monster rubric. And so now I've had a go at Turnitin, I've had a go at grading, now I'm going to have a go at rubrics. But please, I'm not criticizing these common practices just for the sake of it. But I really think that if we can look at them with new eyes, we can see the potential, those little glimmers of possibility for assessment that is both more just and helps to nurture just individuals and helps us lead less stressful lives and also more joyful and rewarding lives. So rubrics have been promoted for, again, 10, 12 years as the answer to the idea of how do we justify how muchness? And I've already said, well, I don't think we should do that. Now, here's the second problem with rubrics. Now, I know you can't see this one. I want that there to look like that because I want you to see how complicated that is. And I just want you to pause for a moment and imagine you're reading a master's dissertation and you've got to be looking at this. Now, let's look at it close up. Now, a lot of work has gone into this, and I am not criticizing the colleagues who've done it. They've done a really good piece of work in a culture where they are asked to produce a rubric. But I really wonder about whether that is the best use of their scholarly minds and their time. So this is from this is for a history dissertation. And so as I'm marking it, I have to give 9% of the way to critical thinking, content, discourse, and another 9% to critical thinking, integration of ideas. But I don't know the difference. I don't understand the difference. Now, for this to be a credible rubric, there must have been criteria on which those things were differentiated, and so on and so on and so on. And there isn't. There isn't. You know, the idea that these are actually making everything transparent, they're not. They're making an illusion of transparency. And an illusion of transparency is much worse than something that's genuinely opaque. And then we have, you know, so development of scholarly conversation is only 8%. So someone's made that decision that critical thinking, content, discourse is 9, but development of scholarly conversation is 8. Somebody's spent time to make that dissertation, to make that difference. Now imagine you're the marker. This is the final piece of work of a student in history. And I always imagine it's written about the French Revolution. the French Revolution, it's exciting. You know, there's smoke and big dresses and sex and scandal and intrigue and battles going on and tragedy and horror. And while I'm trying to engage with that, I have to think, okay, hold on. Is the development of scholarly conversation, is it 1, 2, 3, that, and what's the difference between the critic? It's just, what an awful way to spend your day. And this is what we're doing to ourselves. And the sad thing is we're doing it and it's unnecessary. But it's also, let's go back to that. What is academic work? What is the academic work that we are trying to assess here? It's ethical engagement with the minds of others. And this idea of breaking it into little bits for students and that's helpful to them. And we do this genuinely believing it's helpful. The problem is it's the big picture that they need to see. So this painting, I believe, is from Birmingham Art Gallery. I do try and tailor things to the local place, and I hope one day I can go and see it. But if you were using this as a metaphor for that dissertation, it's not about this little bit of window here or this or that. And yeah, there's a point to some extent in talking about the detail. But at the end of the day, it's the picture as a whole that's telling us a story that has meaning. And academic work, engaging with the minds of others, is about the full picture. Yes, we have to learn about the palette of colors, building blocks. But at the end of the day, students also have to have this. And that is my concern. This is where the fun is. This is why most of us became academics, because we want to engage at this level of complex ideas and we want to share it with others. The great writer on higher education, Stephen Rowland, many years ago said that pedagogic love is what you need to be a higher education teacher. And it involves two things. It involves love of subject and love of sharing that subject. And this surely is the sort of thing we want to share, not those funny little bits and pieces there. So finally, foundation question 4, how important is it that we treat all students the same? I'm sure you know where I'm going with this. So the idea of assessment and fairness has been in the literature for quite some time. And it sort of goes along like this, that justice equals fairness, that to the extent before, I started writing about all this stuff, if you looked at the assessment literature, to the extent it talked about justice, it talked about fairness. And fairness was about proper process. So it was a very Rawlsian view of justice. Get the procedures in place and the right outcome will follow. And as Martha Nussbaum, the great philosopher, said, okay, procedures might matter, but it's the outcome too that matters. This belief in procedure in assessment, the belief in procedure as an end in itself really takes us away from that joy of that big, exciting painting or whatever else our discipline represents. And remember that, a Rawlsian view of justice is based upon a thought experiment. And what I think has happened, and this is a very socially ingrained view that again comes from this idea of norm-based things and competition, is that we've continued with a thought experiment and not even realized it. Because in a thought experiment, you define certain variables. And that's what we do when we talk about assessment and fairness. Some variables come into play and others do not. What if we change those variables? So we have this idea that there has to be a finish line and everyone has to finish at the same time. They also have to submit their essay at the same time because that's fair and that's the process. And to the extent that we think about EDI, we do it in a way that actually is very against the principles of EDI because we have to say there's charitable exceptions, exceptional circumstances. You have to prove you're different. We need to see Granny's death certificate so that you can hand your essay in a week later. Meantime, you've got 150 essays on your desk. You're not marking them all at once. that we have to assess everyone in the same way. Because if we don't assess them in the same way, we can't compare them, and we need to do those precise marking judgments. And so it gets too complicated. And that we assume a certain sort of knowledge that is standard. We have this, the epistemist, I can't say that now that I've been trying, but we have this idea of knowledge privileging the Western Enlightenment. And unless we understand how we have to dismantle that, we can never really achieve our commitment to decolonisation, which is surely at the heart of EDI. So in an article I wrote some time ago, I sort of challenged the idea of what we mean by, I focused on inclusion, but I think the argument applies to equality and diversity, and really the three concepts that live together. But a lot of the time when people talk about inclusion in higher education, they talk about widening participation and they talk about metrics, how many students from certain background have we got in, and is it increasing? Is there academic performance in line with students from other sorts of backgrounds? Now, those metrics are helpful, but that isn't what inclusion means on its own. Because very often in that, inclusion is simply, again, an illusion. It's the working class student coming in, pretending to be middle class or their version of what they think it is, as a way of feeling included. Genuine inclusion comes when people come into higher education and can be themselves and can flourish on that basis. And the same counts in assessment. This idea of sameness as fairness is really damaging, because inclusion, obviously diversity, are about the flourishing of people on the basis of the fact that they're different and that they're allowed to be different. And you have these awful stories of people who park an identity at the front gate of the university when they walk in, and then the same when they go home to mum and dad, they park their university identity at the front door and go in and pretend to be the person that they think they used to be. So I borrowed this picture from your website. I hope I'm allowed to do that. But I can see that your university has this very genuine commitment to EDI. And I know from friends who live in Birmingham that is a very diverse place. But we have to really think through the implications of this for assessment. And you cannot have this commitment to EDI and cling on to a belief of fairness as sameness. So I can hear people saying, yeah, but what about the learning outcomes? Are you saying people don't have to meet the learning outcomes? No, I'm not. I'm just saying there are different ways of meeting the learning outcomes. Just like my husband and I can pack the dishwasher differently and the whole world doesn't collapse. It all works fine. Yes, we have professional body requirements, but again, they're not actually about identical behavior. And we have to sometimes push back at our colleagues in the areas with professional body requirements and not let that just be an excuse for not doing stuff, because professional bodies have their own commitments to EDI. And we are not trying to produce doctors who all think the same. Yes, we want to have the same level of competence, but from that, demonstrating it can happen in different ways. And so, it's difficult to work out how we maintain our commitment to learning outcomes and to professional body requirements and embrace EDI genuinely. But the solution is not to try and fit everyone in to straight rows. That's just administratively convenient, but it's educationally and socially very harmful. And this is a hard one. We have to find the time to think about it. And so I want to end with the idea of trust, which was in my title. And because for me, trust is here with everything I've talked about today. And when I first wrote my book on assessment for social justice, which has a chapter on trust, it was sort of, well, it was ignored or it was sort of gently made fun of. Oh, Jan, you can't have trust with assessment. You know, you can't trust a surgeon. You know, again, it's always surgeons we talk about. And I'm not saying that, but I really do believe that we have to recognize the importance of trust to so many of the things we hold dear in terms of ethical engagement with the minds of others, and see that it has to have a greater say in how we do assessment, or we really have nowhere to go in this age of generative AI. And so, you know, I also say in terms of respecting EDI, this is about trust. We don't ask someone to prove that they're a good person because they're a different color. We trust them to be a good person, regardless of color, until they show otherwise. It's always about trust, all of these values. And students and staff need a shared commitment to the purpose of assessment. And this is what we don't have. And this is probably the greatest barrier to assessment reform and to promoting EDI through assessment. Because at the moment, students see it as a race or just a tick box, and staff see it as a burden, and nobody's happy, and it's not fulfilling its potential. It's not a disaster out there, but we're way short of what we could be doing, and we're certainly way short of fulfilling our responsibilities in terms of EDI. And we need to remove or at least minimize the distortions and distractions. Okay, you can't change everything in your university, but actually, you know, assessment regulations can be changed. If everyone in this room, who I can't see you all, but if you all got together and made a good case, the university is not unreasonable. Regulations do change. Practices change, norms change. Not saying they change easily all of the time, but it is untrue to say they cannot be changed. And we need to focus in assessment on trust, because that is how we focus on the value of the ethical engagement with the minds of others and the importance of that to each of our own human flourishing as members of society. And that is the purpose of what we do, in my view. And so I want to say we can escape. Won't be easy, but we can escape. And together we look for those little fissures and opportunities.